There are places buried beneath the earth that refuse to give up their secrets, temples carved with impossible precision, swords forged from steel that should not have existed for another 800 years, entire cities swallowed by the sea, their streets still visible beneath the waves. These are not myths, they are not legends. They are real, documented, studied discoveries that have left archaeologists, historians and scientists searching for answers that never quite come. Across every continent, on the floors of oceans and inside the walls of caves, traces of our past sit quietly, waiting. Some of these discoveries challenge the timeline of human civilization itself. Others suggest that ancient peoples understood principles of engineering, metallurgy, and navigation that we once believed belonged only to the modern world. And a few of them are so strange, so out of place, that they seem to belong to a chapter of history that has been entirely erased. Tonight, we are going to explore 10 of the strangest and most baffling archaeological finds ever uncovered. Each one has been studied, each one has been debated, and each one remains in its own way, unexplained. So settle in, get comfortable, and let these mysteries unfold at their own pace. Whether you are watching, listening in the background, or drifting off to sleep, the stories will be here. There is no rush, just the quiet company of questions that have lingered for centuries, and in some cases for millennia. Let us begin in South America. High in the Peruvian Andes, overlooking the ancient city of Cusco, there is a place that has baffled engineers and archaeologists for generations. High in the Peruvian Andes, at an altitude of roughly 12,000 feet above sea level, overlooking what was once the beating heart of the Inca Empire, lies one of the most astonishing constructions in the ancient world, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. It is a place of breathtaking scale. Massive stone walls stretch across the landscape, built with a level of precision so extraordinary that they have survived earthquakes, centuries of weathering, and the deliberate dismantling efforts of the Spanish colonizers, who tore apart much of the original structure to build their own churches and government buildings in the city below. And yet, even in its diminished state, even with an estimated 60% of the original complex destroyed during the colonial period, what remains is enough to leave anyone standing before it in silence. Because the stones that form these walls are not ordinary building blocks. They are among the largest ever used in any construction in the pre-Hispanic Americas. Some weigh between 120 and 200 tons. They stand over 8 meters tall, and they fit together so tightly, so perfectly, that even after all this time, you cannot slide a single sheet of paper between them. No mortar holds them in place. Nothing but the sheer precision of their cutting and the brilliance of their arrangement keeps these walls standing. And standing they have, through earthquake after earthquake that has levelled colonial buildings in Cusco just below, crumbled modern concrete, and split stone foundations in half. The walls of Sacsayhuaman do not crack, they do not collapse. They shift ever so slightly during seismic events, and then they settle back into place, as if remembering exactly where they belong. This engineering technique, known as ashlar masonry, involves carefully shaping and arranging stones in a way that allows controlled movement during an earthquake without structural failure. It is remarkably sophisticated. Modern seismic engineers study it, and the fact that it was achieved without mortar, without metal fasteners, without any of the tools we would consider essential for such work, only deepens the mystery. The site itself follows a distinctive zigzag pattern, with the longest wall stretching for roughly 400 meters across 3 massive terraces that rise like giant steps carved into the hillside. Some researchers believe this zigzag design was purely defensive, creating angles that would expose attackers to crossfire. Others suggest a deeper symbolic meaning, possibly representing the jagged shape of lightning, a sacred force in Andean cosmology. Still others have proposed that the zigzag represents the teeth of a puma, since the Inca capital of Cusco was deliberately laid out in the shape of that animal, with Sacsayhuaman serving as its head. Mainstream archaeology attributes the construction of Sacsayhuaman to the Inca Empire during the 15th century, under the reign of Emperor Pachacuti, the same ruler credited with commissioning the more famous Machu Picchu. Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote in 1553 that the Inca ordered 20,000 men to be sent from the surrounding provinces to work on the fortress. Historical records describe decades of labour, teams of workers quarrying the massive blocks, shaping them with stone tools, and then somehow transporting them across miles of rugged mountainous terrain to the building site. And this is where the questions begin to multiply. The Incas had no wheels. They had no large draft animals. They had no pulleys, no cranes, and no known form of advanced engineering machinery. The official explanation is that thousands of workers dragged the stones using thick ropes and wooden rollers, slowly inching them across the landscape through sheer force of human labour and extraordinary organisational coordination. And while this is certainly possible, it is also true that even today, with modern equipment, moving stones of this size would be a significant logistical challenge. The nearest quarry for some of these immense blocks was several miles away, across terrain that includes steep hills, ravines, and uneven ground. Transporting a 200-ton stone across that landscape without wheels or draft animals would have required not just manpower, but an incredibly sophisticated understanding of weight distribution, leverage, and coordinated labour on a scale that is rarely seen even in modern construction projects. Then there is the question of the shaping itself. How were these enormous irregular blocks cut with such precision that they interlock like pieces of a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle? Each stone is a different shape, a different size, and yet each one fits perfectly against its neighbours on every side. This is not the work of rough chiselling. This is something far more deliberate. Some researchers have suggested that the builders may have used a technique of slowly grinding stones against one another, creating a natural fit over time. Others have proposed more speculative ideas, including the existence of a now-lost plant-based substance that could soften stone, allowing it to be moulded like clay before hardening again. That idea comes from local legends and has never been scientifically proven, but it speaks to just how difficult it is to explain the precision on display. What adds another layer to the mystery is that Sacsayhuaman may not have been built entirely by the Incas at all. Archeological studies of surface collections of pottery at the site indicate that the earliest occupation of the hilltop dates to about 900 CE, several centuries before the Inca Empire reached its height. This corresponds to the Quilque culture, a pre-Inca civilization that built upon the site before the Inca arrived and expanded it dramatically. Some researchers have proposed that the most megalithic elements of the construction, the truly massive lower courses of stone, may belong to this earlier period, with the Inca building upon and extending what they found already standing. If that is true, then the engineering knowledge required to build the most impressive parts of Sacsayhuaman may have originated with a culture about which we know very little, a people who left behind massive stone walls, but no written records explaining how they achieved what they did. There are also features at Sacsayhuaman that go beyond simple walls and terraces. Remnants of what appear to be large doorways, tunnels, and water channels have been found integrated into the complex, hinting that the site served multiple purposes beyond just defence. Some sections feature enormous circular depressions carved into the rock, thought by some researchers to have been ceremonial plazas or astronomical observation platforms. Deep-cut channels that may have directed water in specific patterns have also been identified, possibly for religious rituals connected to water and fertility, themes that were central to Indian spiritual life. The Incas revered water as a life-giving force, and many of their sacred sites incorporate elaborate hydraulic features. If Sacsayhuaman included a water management system, it would link the site to a broader tradition of Inca engineering that extended from the terraces of Machu Picchu to the fountains of Tambomachai. The purpose of Sacsayhuaman is debated as well. The Spanish conquistadors, upon first seeing its massive walls, immediately assumed it was a military fortress, and that assumption was tested in blood. In 1536, during the Great Inca Rebellion led by Manco Inca Yupanqui against the Spanish occupation, Sacsayhuaman became the site of one of the fiercest and most desperate battles of the conquest. The Inca forces retook the fortress and used its massive walls as a defensive stronghold against the Spanish counterattack. The battle raged for days, the Spanish fighting uphill against fortifications designed to repel exactly this kind of assault, suffered heavy casualties. One of the Inca commanders, a warrior named Quixote, is said to have thrown himself from one of the towers rather than surrender. The Spanish eventually prevailed, but at enormous cost, and they recognized immediately that the fortress they had just taken was unlike anything they had encountered in Europe. After the conquest, the Spanish systematically dismantled much of Sacsayhuaman, hauling away the upper courses of stonework to build the churches and colonial buildings that still stand in Cusco today. Only the largest megalithic blocks, the ones too heavy to move, were left behind. What we see today is, in a sense, the skeleton of Sacsayhuaman, the bones of a much larger and more complex structure, stripped of everything that could be carried away. But many archaeologists believe the site was far more than a defensive structure. Evidence suggests it may have served as a ceremonial or religious centre, possibly dedicated to the Inca sun god Inti, the most important deity in their belief system. The Spanish chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, who was of Inca descent himself, wrote that Sacsayhuaman was designed to represent the head of a puma, since the Inca capital of Cusco was laid out in the shape of that sacred animal. Others have proposed that it functioned as a royal retreat, a place of governance, or a gathering point for important astronomical observations, given its commanding view of the valley and the sky. Every year on June 24th, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, thousands of people gather at Sacsayhuaman to celebrate Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, a tradition that dates back to the height of the Inca Empire and was revived in the 20th century. The site remains a living connection to the past, not just a ruin, but a place where history and ceremony continue to meet. And yet, for all the study, all the theories and all the efforts to explain what stands on that hilltop above Cusco, no one has been able to fully account for how it was built. The logistics of moving stones that weigh as much as a commercial airliner, the precision of fitting them together without mortar and without modern tools, the earthquake-resistant engineering that outperforms much of what we build today. These are not small questions. They are fundamental challenges to our understanding of what ancient civilizations were capable of achieving. Sacsayhuaman stands as one of the great unanswered riddles of the ancient world, a place where history and engineering blur into something that feels almost impossible. Its walls remain silent, holding whatever secrets they were built to contain. And the deeper you look, the more you realize that the story of this place is far from complete. Some mysteries are carved into stone, standing in full view for centuries, daring us to explain them. Others are forged in fire, hidden inside the metal of weapons that should not have been possible to create. And sometimes, the most baffling discoveries are not grand monuments at all, but small, deadly objects that rewrite what we thought we knew about an entire era of human history. Across the world, in the hands of Viking warriors over 1,000 years ago, another mystery was forged, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about medieval metallurgy, about the limits of ancient craftsmanship, and about just how far the trade routes of the early medieval world truly extended. They are called the Ulfbert swords, and they are, by any measure, weapons that should not have existed for another 800 years. To understand why these swords are so remarkable, you first need to understand what sword making looked like in early medieval Europe. During the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries, the vast majority of European swords were made using a process called bloomery smelting. This was the standard method for producing iron and steel at the time. The problem with bloomery smelting is that it could not achieve the temperatures necessary to fully liquefy iron. Instead, it produced a spongy mass of metal mixed with impurities known as slag, which made the resulting steel inconsistent and relatively brittle. A sword forged from bloomery iron could serve its purpose, but it was far from ideal. The blades were heavy, they dulled quickly, and in the chaos of battle they could shatter on impact. The Ulfbert swords were different, completely, fundamentally different. When modern metallurgists analysed the steel of the genuine Ulfbert blades, they found something that should have been impossible for the era. The metal was made from crucible steel, a far more advanced material produced by heating iron to extraordinarily high temperatures, above 1500 degrees Celsius, until it fully liquefied. This process allowed impurities to be removed and the carbon content to be precisely controlled, resulting in a steel of remarkable purity and consistency. The carbon content in genuine Ulfbert blades measured up to 1.2%, a level comparable to modern industrial steel. This was not supposed to be achievable in medieval Europe. The technology for producing crucible steel was not officially documented on the continent until the Industrial Revolution, nearly 8 centuries after the last Ulfbert was forged. And yet, here they were, approximately 170 of them discovered across Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and even parts of Russia, each bearing a distinctive inscription along the blade. The name Ulfbert, flanked by crosses, pressed into the metal in a style that functioned almost like an ancient brand name. The inscription itself is believed to derive from a Frankish personal name, which has led many researchers to conclude that the swords were originally produced in the Frankish Empire, possibly in what is now France or Germany, rather than in Scandinavia itself. But the Frankish connection raises its own questions, because Charlemagne and his successors enacted strict laws prohibiting the sale of weapons to the Vikings, who were their enemies. If these swords were Frankish in origin, they would have had to reach Viking hands through black market trade, raiding, or smuggling. What made the Ulfbert so desirable was not just its inscription, but what the inscription promised. A genuine Ulfbert was sharper, lighter, and more flexible than any other sword available in Europe at the time. It could withstand heavy blows without breaking. It could cut through inferior weapons and armour with relative ease. In a world where a warrior's life depended on the quality of his blade, an Ulfbert was priceless, and people knew it. The demand for Ulfbert swords was so great that counterfeiters attempted to cash in on the reputation. Archaeometallurgist Alan Williams, who conducted one of the most comprehensive studies of Ulfbert swords ever undertaken, examined 44 specimens and found a striking divide. Only 11 of those swords, specifically those bearing the inscription with the cross placed after the final letter T, were made from genuine high-carbon crucible steel. The other 33 bore the Ulfbert name, but they were made from lower-quality iron, essentially medieval knockoffs marketed under a prestigious brand. The existence of these counterfeits tells us something important. The Ulfbert name carried enough weight and enough market value that blacksmiths across Europe were willing to forge imitations, hoping their customers would not know the difference, and for a buyer on a battlefield, the consequences of owning a fake could be catastrophic. One clash of blade on blade, and a counterfeit Ulfbert could shatter like glass. So where did the genuine crucible steel come from? This is the question that sits at the centre of the Ulfbert mystery. Crucible steel was not developed in Europe during the Viking Age, but it was well established elsewhere. In India and Sri Lanka, sophisticated steel-making techniques had been in use since approximately 300 BCE. The famous Damascus steel of the Middle East, renowned for its distinctive patterns and extraordinary strength, was produced using similar high-carbon methods, and in Central Asia, particularly in the regions of modern-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, a crucible steel industry had taken root by the 8th century. The leading theory is that Viking traders encountered this superior steel through their extensive trade networks. The Viking world was far more connected than we tend to give it credit for. The Varangians, a group of Norse warriors and merchants, travelled deep into Russia, establishing settlements and trade routes along the rivers that connected northern Europe to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates. Vikings traded with the Middle East extensively, acquiring luxury goods like silk, spices, and silver. It is plausible that along these very routes they also obtained high-quality steel ingots, or perhaps even learned advanced forging techniques from Eastern blacksmiths. This theory is supported by the geographical distribution of Ulfberht finds. While many were discovered in Scandinavia, particularly in Norway and Finland, with approximately 25 swords found in each country, others have turned up along the Varangian trade routes in Russia and Ukraine, where roughly 20 more have been recovered. The swords follow the paths that Viking traders would have taken, and those paths were remarkably long. The Varangians travelled down the Volga River to the Caspian Sea, which put them within reach of the great trading cities of Persia and Central Asia. They also followed the Dnieper River southward to the Black Sea and the gates of Constantinople, the wealthiest city in the medieval world. Arabic silver coins, known as dirhams, have been found in enormous quantities in Scandinavian hoards, proving that trade between the Viking world and the Islamic world was not just occasional but sustained, systematic, and immensely profitable. It is within this context that the Ulfberht makes sense. The Vikings were not isolated warriors raiding from the frozen north. They were navigators, merchants, and cultural intermediaries who connected the Atlantic to the Caspian, Scandinavia to Baghdad. If high-quality crucible steel was available along the trade routes of Central Asia, the Vikings were exactly the kind of people who would find it, recognize its value, and bring it home. The connection to Damascus steel is particularly intriguing. Damascus steel, famous for its distinctive watered or swirling surface pattern, was produced in the Middle East, using a raw material known as Wootz steel, which originated in India and Sri Lanka. Like the crucible steel of the Ulfberht swords, Wootz steel had an unusually high carbon content and was produced through a smelting process that exceeded the capabilities of standard European bloomery furnaces. The two types of steel are not identical, but they share a common principle: the ability to produce iron of extraordinary purity and strength through precise control of temperature and carbon levels. Whether the Vikings obtained finished ingots of this material or learned the techniques to produce it themselves, the result was the same: a weapon that was, for its time, without equal. On the battlefield, the advantage of an Ulfberht would have been immediately and viscerally apparent. Viking combat was brutal, close quarters fighting where the quality of a blade could mean the difference between life and death. A warrior with a genuine Ulfberht was carrying a sword that could cut through the inferior iron weapons and armour of his opponents. It was lighter, which meant faster strikes. It was more flexible, which meant it could absorb the shock of a heavy blow without snapping, and it held its edge longer, which meant that even after extended combat, the blade remained dangerously sharp. In a world where warriors named their swords and believed they carried a kind of spiritual power, the Ulfberht must have seemed almost supernatural. But even if we accept that the raw material came from the East, the question of how Viking or Frankish blacksmiths shaped it into finished weapons remains difficult to answer. Crucible steel is notoriously difficult to work. The forging process requires sustained high temperatures and extraordinary skill to avoid ruining the material. When modern-day swordsmith Rick Furrer attempted to recreate an Ulfberht sword for a Nova and National Geographic documentary using period-appropriate tools and techniques as much as possible, the process took 11 full hours of continuous forging. Just transforming the crucible steel ingot into a blade shape required the kind of sustained effort and expertise that would have been rare even among the most skilled medieval craftsmen. Furrer described the experience as one of the most challenging forging projects he had ever undertaken. And then there is the matter of the Ulfberht's disappearance. Genuine crucible steel Ulfberht swords appear in the archaeological record beginning around 800 CE. They continue for roughly 2 centuries, and then they vanish. After approximately 1000 CE, No more genuine Ulfbert blades were produced, only the crude imitations remained, and even those eventually faded away. The abrupt end to production has led some historians to speculate that the trade routes supplying crucible steel were disrupted, possibly by political upheaval or conflict in Central Asia. Others suggest that the small group of master smiths who possessed the knowledge to work crucible steel may have died, without passing on their secrets. The knowledge was lost. The supply dried up, and for nearly 1,000 years European metallurgy would not reach that level of sophistication again. There is also a more recent twist to the story. In 2022, Ukrainian authorities seized an archaeological collection from a former politician that included an Ulfbert sword of unknown origin, obtained through archaeological looting. In 2025, a plea agreement resulted in the donation of the entire collection, including the sword, to the National Museum of the History of Ukraine. It is a reminder that even now, these weapons continue to surface, carrying with them the weight of a mystery that has never been fully resolved. Were the Ulfbert swords the product of Viking innovation, the work of secretive Frankish blacksmiths, or the result of knowledge borrowed from ancient Central Asian or Indian steelmaking traditions? Could there have been a lost centre of metallurgical excellence, an unknown forge where someone had mastered the secrets of high-carbon steel centuries before the Industrial Age? Like the megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman, the Ulfbert swords stand as evidence of skill and intelligence that does not fit neatly into our understanding of the past. Whether they were forged by Viking smiths or acquired from distant lands, they remain one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of medieval history. And if techniques like these once existed and were lost, one has to wonder what other forgotten knowledge has been buried by time. Some mysteries are forged in fire, others are preserved in ice, and some secrets are buried so deep, in places so remote and so hostile, that they only reveal themselves when the cold releases its grip, if only for a moment, before sealing them away again. High in the Indian Himalayas, nearly 16,500 feet above sea level, in a place so remote that it takes days of trekking through mountain passes just to reach it, there is a lake. It is small, only about 40 meters across. For most of the year it is frozen solid, its surface concealed beneath a layer of ice and snow, surrounded by towering peaks and an eerie silence that makes it feel like the edge of the world. But when the ice melts, something surfaces that has puzzled scientists, historians and travellers for the better part of a century. Bones. Hundreds of them. Human skeletons scattered along the shore and visible beneath the clear, shallow water. Skulls, rib cages and femurs, some still bearing remnants of clothing and wooden walking sticks, frozen in time, preserved by the altitude and the cold, lying exactly where they fell. No weapons beside them, no signs of burial, no obvious explanation for why so many people died in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. This is Rupkund Lake, known to locals and to the wider world as Skeleton Lake, and its story, which scientists once thought they understood, turned out to be far stranger than anyone imagined. The outside world first took notice of Rupkund in the 1940s, when a British forest ranger patrolling the area stumbled upon the skeletal remains and raised the alarm. What he found was unlike anything recorded before. Hundreds of human bones, perfectly preserved by the cold, their condition suggesting they had been there for a very long time. Some were still wearing remnants of leather sandals. Others had jewellery and personal items frozen alongside them. There were no signs of a battle, no weapons scattered among the remains, and no indication that these people had been deliberately buried. Whatever happened to them, it happened suddenly, and it happened right there, on the shore of that frozen lake. For decades, scientists could do little more than speculate. Early theories ranged widely. Some suggested the remains belonged to soldiers from an ancient war, perhaps a failed army caught in the mountains during a military campaign. Others proposed a mass burial site, a place where bodies had been deliberately carried and laid to rest, but neither theory explained the random scattering of the bones, the lack of weapons, or the absence of any traditional burial markers. Something unusual had happened at Rupkund. something that left these people stranded and dead in one of the most remote and dangerous environments on the planet. It was not until the early 2000s that modern science began to provide real answers, and those answers only deepened the mystery. In 2019, an international team of researchers published a landmark study in Nature Communications, one of the world's leading scientific journals. Led by Edwin Harney of Harvard University and Neeraj Rai of the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleosciences in India, the team analysed genome-wide ancient DNA from 38 of the skeletons found at Rupkund. It was the first whole genome ancient DNA data ever extracted from remains found in South Asia, and the results were, to use the researchers' own word, astonishing. The skeletons did not belong to a single group of people. They belonged to 3 genetically distinct populations, separated not just by ancestry, but by time. The first group, comprising 23 individuals, had ancestry that fell within the range of present-day South Asian populations. Radiocarbon dating placed their deaths at roughly 800 in CE, around 1200 years ago, but even within this group, there was surprising diversity. These were not members of a single community or social class. Their genetic profiles were heterogeneous, meaning they came from different populations across South Asia. And stable isotope analysis of their diets revealed highly variable eating patterns, suggesting they belonged to different socioeconomic groups. Some ate diets heavy in millet, typical of certain Indian regions. Others had diets more common in different parts of the subcontinent. This was not a uniform group. It was a collection of individuals from across the Indian world, brought together at this remote lake, for reasons that remain unknown. The second group was the one that shocked everyone. 14 individuals had ancestry that was not South Asian at all. Their genetic profiles match present-day populations from the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically resembling modern-day Greeks and Cretans, and their radiocarbon dates placed them at roughly 1800 CE, approximately 1,000 years after the first group died. These 14 people showed no genetic admixture with South Asian populations. They were Mediterranean, through and through, and they had somehow ended up dead at a remote glacial lake in the Himalayas during a period when there is no known historical record of any Mediterranean presence in the region. There was also a single individual with Southeast Asian ancestry, dated to the same later period as the Mediterranean group. The implications of these findings were staggering. First, they proved beyond any doubt that the skeletons at Rupkund were not the result of a single catastrophic event. People had been dying at this lake in separate episodes, separated by roughly 1,000 years. Second, the presence of individuals with Eastern Mediterranean ancestry at a location over 5,000 meters above sea level in the Indian Himalayas was completely unprecedented. No historical records, no trade documents, no travel accounts from the period explain what people of Greek or Cretan descent were doing in this place around 1800 CE. The researchers themselves acknowledged the mystery. David Reich of Harvard Medical School described the finding as raising a striking question about how migrants from the Eastern Mediterranean, with an ancestry profile extremely atypical of the region today, came to die in this place only a few hundred years ago. Neeraj Rai admitted that despite trying to answer all possible sources of genetic ancestry, the team had failed to explain why Mediterranean people were travelling to this lake and what they were doing there. So what killed them? The physical evidence provides a chilling clue. When scientists analysed the skull fractures found on many of the skeletons, they discovered a consistent pattern. The injuries were not caused by weapons, avalanches or rock slides. They were caused by something falling from above with extreme force. The fractures were concentrated on the tops of the skulls, as if the victims had been struck down by large, heavy objects raining from the sky. The best explanation that scientists have proposed is a sudden, catastrophic hailstorm. Not ordinary hail, but hailstones so massive and so forceful that they killed people on impact. Given the lake's location, perched in a natural basin surrounded by ridges that could funnel and intensify a storm a severe weather event could have trapped and killed an entire group of travellers with terrifying speed. This theory gains credibility from an ancient local legend that has been passed down for generations among the people of the region. The story tells of a royal pilgrimage, a king and his wife and their entourage travelling through the mountains. According to the legend, they angered the goddess of the region with their arrogance, and in punishment she sent a storm of hard round stones as large as iron balls that killed them all. For centuries, this was just a folk tale, a cautionary myth meant to warn travellers about the dangers of the high passes, but now, the physical evidence seemed to suggest there was truth buried within the legend. If a hailstorm killed the earlier South Asian group around 800 CE, that would explain the skull fractures, the lack of weapons, and the scattered placement of the bodies. But it does not explain the later Mediterranean group. Did the same kind of event happen again, 1,000 years later, to a completely different group of people from a completely different part of the world? If so, why were people of Greek or Cretan ancestry at this remote Himalayan lake in the first place? Were they pilgrims, traders, explorers? And why is there no historical record of their journey? Some researchers have speculated that the Mediterranean individuals might have been connected to the Nanda Devi Raj Jat pilgrimage, a famous Hindu pilgrimage route that passes near Rupkund and takes place every 12 years. But William Sachs, head of Heidelberg University's anthropology department and an expert on the pilgrimage, has dismissed this possibility, stating that the scenario simply would not make sense in the context of the tradition. Others have wondered whether Rupkund was part of a larger, now forgotten trade or migration route connecting distant cultures in ways we do not yet understand. The presence of Mediterranean ancestry at such an isolated location raises the possibility that the ancient and medieval worlds were more interconnected than conventional history suggests, with individuals travelling far greater distances than we typically assume. Even today, Rupkund Lake remains one of the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth. During most of the year it is frozen, its surface concealing the bones hidden beneath. But when the ice melts in the brief Himalayan summer, the skeletons resurface, staring back from the past as if reminding the world that their story remains unfinished. The 2019 study brought us closer to understanding Rupkund than ever before, but in many ways it only revealed how much we still do not know. Why did multiple groups of people from different parts of the world, centuries apart, die at this same remote lake? Were the deaths all caused by natural disasters? Or was there something about this place, something that drew people to it, only for them to never return? The lake remains silent. It holds its secrets beneath the ice, and for now every new finding raises more questions than it answers. Rupkund is one of those rare places where science and mystery sit side by side, each advancing and retreating in equal measure, leaving us with a story that is still being written. The mystery of Rupkund Lake reminds us that some of history's strangest discoveries are not buried deep underground but hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right conditions to reveal themselves. And even when science steps in with answers, some pieces never quite fit, leaving us with more questions than we started with. But not all ancient mysteries are concealed beneath ice and snow. Some have been standing for thousands of years, their true origins lost to time, and some of the most puzzling are not grand monuments at all, but small, unassuming objects that refuse to be understood. On a summer day in 1908, on the sun-baked island of Crete, Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier was nearing the end of a long and largely frustrating excavation season. He had been working at the ancient Minoan Palace of Phaistos, a sprawling complex on the island's southern coast that had once been one of the great centres of Minoan civilization. And there, sitting in a layer of fine ash mixed with debris from the palace's destruction, was a small object that would become one of the most debated artefacts in the entire history of archaeology. It was a disc, a flat circular piece of fired clay, roughly 16 centimetres in diameter, about the size of a bread plate. Both sides were covered in a spiral of symbols, pressed into the clay in a pattern that ran from the outer edge toward the centre. The symbols were not carved. They had been stamped one at a time, using individual preformed seals pressed into the wet clay before it was fired. Each stamp carried a single pictogram, and no two stamps were identical. This was the Phaistos disc, and in the century since its discovery, no one has been able to definitively read a single word of it. The numbers alone make the disc remarkable. It contains 241 individual symbol impressions, drawn from a set of 45 distinct signs. Those signs are arranged in 61 groups, separated by small vertical lines that most researchers interpret as word or phrase boundaries. Some of the symbols are recognizable. There are figures that resemble walking humans, birds, fish, flowers, and what appears to be a feathered headdress. Others are more abstract, geometric shapes and patterns that resist easy identification. But what makes the Phaistos disc truly extraordinary is its method of creation. Each symbol was pressed into the wet clay using a separate, pre-made stamp. This is, by any reasonable interpretation, an early form of movable type, the same principle that Johannes Gutenberg would not apply to printing in Europe until roughly 3,200 years later. Someone on Crete, during the Bronze Age, had manufactured a set of individual character stamps and used them to produce a text. The level of planning and organisation this implies is remarkable for any era, let alone for a time when most writing was done by hand with a pointed stylus. The disc was found alongside a Linear A tablet, one of the two undeciphered writing systems used by the Minoans. Linear A remains unreadable to this day, but the symbols on the Phaistos disc are not Linear A. They are something else entirely. They do not match Cretan hieroglyphic script. They do not match Linear B, the later Mycenaean writing system that was eventually deciphered in the 1950s. The Phaistos disc appears to be written in a script that exists on no other known object anywhere in the world. This is the core of the problem. Every successful decipherment in the history of linguistics has required multiple texts, preferably with some overlap or a bilingual reference point, like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Phaistos disc gives us none of that. There is one disc, one inscription, and one script that appears nowhere else. Trying to translate it is, as one scholar put it, like trying to solve a crossword puzzle with no clues. That has not stopped people from trying. Over the past century, the disc has attracted an enormous range of proposed decipherments. Some scholars have argued it is a syllabic script, with each symbol representing a spoken syllable. Others believe it may be logographic, with symbols representing entire words or ideas. Some have proposed it is a hymn to a Minoan goddess. Others have claimed it is a calendar, a board game, a legal document, or even a record of a voyage. The most prominent recent claim came from Gareth Owens, a linguist at the Technological Educational Institute of Crete, who announced in 2024 that he had deciphered 99% of the disc's content. According to Owens, who has spent over 3 decades studying the artifact, the disc is a religious text, specifically a prayer dedicated to a Minoan mother goddess. He identified keywords by comparing the disc's symbols to Linear A signs that bear a visual resemblance, then used the phonetic values of Linear B, the deciphered Mycenaean script, to sound them out. He stated publicly that there is no doubt the text is religious in nature, based on comparisons with other inscriptions found at holy sites on Crete. However, the scholarly response to Owen's claims has been cautious at best and sharply critical at worst. Thomas Palaima, a specialist in Bronze Age scripts, and Brent Davis, an expert in Aegean writing systems and decipherment theory, have both questioned Owen's methodology. Their objections are fundamental. Linear A, the script Owens relies on as a bridge, is itself undeciphered. The phonetic values assigned to its signs are tentative, borrowed from the similar-looking but not identical signs of Linear B. Using an undeciphered script to decode another undeciphered script introduces layers of uncertainty that make any resulting translation speculative at best. John Younger, another prominent scholar in the field, has been even more direct. He has argued that no trustworthy reading of the Phaistos disk can be produced until another artifact bearing the same signs is discovered. Without comparative material, he says, the disk must be studied as an archaeological artifact rather than as a linguistic text. In other words, we can study what it is made of, how it was made, and where it was found, but we cannot, with any confidence, claim to know what it says, and yet the disk continues to fascinate precisely because it sits at the intersection of so many unanswered questions. Who made it? The Minoans are the most likely candidates, given the archaeological context of its discovery, and several motifs found on the disk, such as dolphins and flowers, are recognizable elements of Minoan art. But some scholars have pointed out that certain symbols, particularly the helmeted warrior figure, do not look particularly Minoan. Arthur Evans himself, the famous archaeologist who excavated Knossos, noted that the human figures on the disk do not dress like typical Minoans. This has led some to suggest that the disk may have been imported from outside Crete, possibly from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, or from another Aegean culture entirely. What was it for? The repetition of certain symbol combinations suggests a structured text, not random decoration. The fact that it was found in what appears to have been a sacred deposit, alongside a linear A tablet, supports the idea that it had religious significance. Some researchers at the Italian School of Archaeology have proposed that the inscription renders a text of a religious or magical nature, based on the repetition of sign groups, but without a translation. This remains an educated guess. Why was it stamped rather than written by hand? This is perhaps the most intriguing question of all. Creating individual stamps for each symbol required significant effort and forethought. It implies that the creator intended to produce multiple copies, or at least had a system in place for efficient reproduction, and yet, no other stamped text from Bronze Age Crete has ever been found. The Phaistos disk appears to be the only example of this technique from its entire civilization and era. It is, as scholars have called it, a unique based on the discovery of comparable motifs on other Cretan artifacts found after the disk was unearthed. A gold ring discovered at Knossos in 1926 shows a similar spiral inscription pattern. Fragments of pottery from Phaistos bear symbols that match some of those on the disk. These later discoveries have effectively put the forgery theory to rest, but they have not put the mystery to rest. The Phaistos disk remains one of the only known examples of a completely undeciphered writing system that exists on a single artifact. Every known language or code that humanity has managed to crack required multiple texts, ideally with some overlap or bilingual reference. The Phaistos disk gives us one object, one message, and a spiral of symbols that might hold a prayer, a story, a list of offerings, or something entirely unknown. It is one of archaeology's most enduring riddles, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it refuses to say. A voice from the past speaking a language we may never fully understand, and perhaps in some way that is what gives it its power. The unknown speaks loudly, even when it says nothing at all. Not all lost civilizations communicate through symbols carved into clay. Some leave behind something far more dramatic, entire underground worlds carved with precision into solid rock, vast enough to hold thousands of people, and yet completely absent from every historical record ever written. Deep in the Zhejiang province of eastern China, in the rolling hills south of the Yangtze River, there is a landscape dotted with small, unremarkable ponds. For as long as anyone in the surrounding villages could remember, these ponds had been a source of quiet curiosity. Local legends warned that the pools were bottomless. No matter how much water was drawn from them, they never seemed to run dry. Fishermen told stories of nets that sank into impossible depths. Elders spoke of something hidden beneath the surface, though no one could say exactly what. For centuries, these were just stories. Local folklore, the kind of thing people mention in passing but never investigate. And then, in 1992, a group of villagers decided to test the legend. They obtained pumps and began draining one of the ponds, expecting to find a natural cavern or perhaps an underground spring that explained the water's persistence. What they found instead was one of the most extraordinary and baffling archaeological discoveries in Chinese history. As the water level dropped, the outline of an enormous chamber began to emerge. Not a natural cave, not a sinkhole, a perfectly carved underground hall with smooth walls, soaring ceilings and intricate geometric patterns chiseled into every surface. The chamber was massive, its dimensions far exceeding anything that could have formed naturally. The walls were straight and even, the ceiling arched overhead with engineered precision, and every inch of the interior was covered in repeating parallel lines, deliberate chisel marks that followed consistent patterns from floor to ceiling. The villagers were stunned, and when word spread and more of the local ponds were drained, the discovery multiplied. One chamber became two became 5, and as the project continued, the number grew to at least 24 separate underground caverns, all of them hand-carved, all of them enormous, and all of them connected by a labyrinth of tunnels and passageways running beneath the hills. These are the Longyu Caves, and they remain one of China's greatest archaeological enigmas. The scale of the Longyu Caves is almost impossible to overstate. The total area of the discovered chambers covers more than 30,000 square meters, roughly 320,000 square feet. Some individual chambers reach heights of nearly 30 meters, roughly 100 feet, with ceilings that arc overhead like the naves of cathedrals. The walls are perfectly smooth, showing no sign of the rough, uneven surfaces you would expect from natural cave formations. These were not carved by water or by geological forces. They were carved by human hands, deliberately, methodically, and with a precision that seems almost industrial in its consistency. And then there is the question that makes every engineer and archaeologist pause. Where did the stone go? When you carve a chamber this size out of solid rock, you produce millions of cubic feet of debris. Stone does not simply disappear. It has to be transported somewhere, piled up, used for construction, dumped in a river, something, and yet no trace of the excavated material has ever been found, not in the surrounding hills, not in the rivers, not in any nearby construction. The stone that was removed from the Longyu Caves is simply gone, as if it was carried away and disposed of so thoroughly that no evidence of it remains. The mystery deepens when you consider the historical record, or rather the complete absence of one. China has one of the longest and most meticulous traditions of historical documentation in the world. Dynasties kept records of construction projects, military campaigns, taxes, population counts, and even weather patterns. Major building projects were documented with the names of their overseers, the number of workers involved, and the purpose of the structure. And yet, in all of China's vast historical archives, there is not a single mention of the Longyu Caves, not one reference, not one document, not one inscription on the cave walls themselves. Archaeologists estimate that the caves were carved at least 2,000 years ago, possibly during the Qin dynasty, which lasted from 221 to 206 BCE, or perhaps during the Han dynasty that followed. But even this is speculation, because there is no direct evidence to anchor the caves to any specific time period. No artifacts have been found inside them, no tools, no pottery, no fire pits or storage areas, no signs of habitation at all. The caves are completely, utterly empty. They contain nothing but their own smooth walls and the repeating chisel marks that cover every surface. Those chisel marks are themselves a subject of debate. They follow consistent patterns, parallel lines that run at regular intervals across the walls and ceilings. Some researchers believe they are decorative, a deliberate artistic choice made by the builders. Others think they may have served a structural function, perhaps providing textural grip to prevent the smooth stone from becoming dangerously slippery in the damp underground environment. still others suggest they may have symbolic or ritualistic significance. Though without any written records or comparative examples, this remains pure speculation. The structural stability of the caves is another point of wonder. Despite being thousands of years old, despite having no visible support pillars, and despite the immense weight of the rock and earth above them, the caves show no signs of collapse, no cracks, no sagging, no structural failures of any kind. The weight distribution appears to have been calculated with remarkable precision, allowing the unsupported ceilings to hold for millennia without reinforcement. This is not easy to achieve, even with modern engineering software and materials. The fact that it was accomplished with hand tools, in total darkness, thousands of years ago, suggests a level of engineering knowledge that is difficult to reconcile with what we know about the era's capabilities. So what were they for? This is the question that haunts every researcher who studies the Longyou caves, and no one has a satisfying answer. The most common theories include a military installation, possibly a hidden stronghold or underground barracks, a quarry where stone was extracted for use in surface construction, a food storage facility, taking advantage of the cool, stable underground temperatures, a religious or ceremonial site where rituals were performed away from the outside world, or a royal project of some kind, perhaps ordered by an emperor whose records have been lost or destroyed. Each theory has its problems. If it was a military installation, there are no defensive features, no gates, no strategic narrow passages. If it was a quarry, there is no record of the stone being used anywhere else, and no debris. If it was for storage, there are no shelves, no containers, no residue of food or goods. If it was a ceremonial site, there are no altars, no carvings of deities, no inscriptions of any kind. And if it was a royal project, the complete absence from historical records is almost impossible to explain in a culture that documented nearly everything. The Longyou caves exist in a kind of historical vacuum. They are physically present, undeniable, enormous, and yet historically they are invisible. No one wrote about building them. No one wrote about using them. No one, as far as we can tell, ever mentioned them at all, until a group of curious villagers drained a pond in 1992 and discovered what had been hiding beneath the surface of their land for thousands of years. Some researchers have proposed that the caves were deliberately hidden, perhaps sealed and flooded on purpose, to conceal them from invaders, future generations, or anyone outside the group that created them. If that is the case, then whoever built the Longyou caves not only possessed extraordinary engineering skill, they also possessed a commitment to secrecy that has proven almost perfectly effective. For at least 2 millennia, the caves remained hidden, their entrances disguised as ordinary ponds, their existence unknown to the millions of people who lived and farmed the land above them. Despite growing interest in the Longyou caves, large-scale archaeological excavation has been limited. Some of the caves have been opened to tourists, but many remain unexplored, their passages still filled with water and their secrets still sealed. Researchers hope that future investigation may uncover tools, artifacts, or inscriptions that could shed light on who built them and why, but for now the caves offer nothing but their own imposing emptiness, a silence that speaks volumes about how much of the past can vanish without a trace. The Longyou caves are a reminder that some of history's greatest mysteries are not about what we have found, but about what is missing. No records, no tools, no debris, no answers. Just 24 enormous chambers carved into the earth with impossible precision, waiting in the darkness for someone to explain why they exist. Before we get into the next mystery, just a quick pause. Whether you are watching this, listening in the background while you work, or drifting off to sleep, these stories unfold just the same. If you are enjoying the journey so far and want to support the channel, as well as get all of our videos without ads, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is in the description below. And if you have not already, hitting subscribe means you will not miss the next time we go deep into the forgotten corners of history. Alright, let us get back to the mysteries. This next one takes us far from China, across the Mediterranean, to a small island where something ancient and deeply unsettling was hiding right beneath the surface. On the small Mediterranean island of Malta, in the quiet town of Paola, construction workers were breaking ground for a new housing development in 1902 when something unexpected happened. Their tools punched through the earth and into empty space. Below the surface, where there should have been solid rock and soil, there was a hollow. And as they widened the opening and peered into the darkness, they realized they had uncovered something that had been sealed away and forgotten for thousands of years. What lay beneath the streets of Paola was not a simple cave or a buried cellar. It was a vast underground labyrinth, a multi-level subterranean complex, carved entirely from the living limestone bedrock, extending down into the earth in a series of interconnected chambers, tunnels and passageways that seemed to go on, deeper and deeper into the darkness. This was the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, and at more than 5,000 years old, it is one of the oldest known underground temples in the world. It is also one of the most disturbing, one of the most acoustically strange, and one of the most fiercely guarded archaeological sites on the planet. The word hypogeum comes from the Greek, meaning literally under the earth, and the name is fitting. The structure spans 3 separate levels, carved progressively deeper into the rock. The uppermost level, believed to be the oldest, consists of natural caves that were gradually enlarged and shaped by human hands. The middle level contains the most architecturally impressive chambers, including pillared halls, rounded walls, and delicately carved ceilings that mimic the appearance of above-ground Neolithic temples. The lowest level, which reaches nearly 12 meters, roughly 40 feet below the surface, contains the deepest and most mysterious chambers, some of which appear to have been deliberately left unfinished, as if the builders stopped their work abruptly and never returned. The architectural detail within the hypogeum is remarkable for its age. The middle level in particular features carved facades that recreate, in underground rock, the trilithon doorways and corbelled ceilings that are found in Malta's famous above-ground megalithic temples, such as the Guntija temples on the neighbouring island of Gozo. These above-ground temples are among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, predating the pyramids of Egypt and Stonehenge by centuries. The fact that the same architectural traditions were carried underground, recreated in solid rock rather than assembled from separate blocks, suggests a culture with deep aesthetic values and a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. But the most chilling discovery within the hypogeum was not its architecture, it was its contents. As archaeologists carefully excavated the chambers, they uncovered the remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals. 7,000. Buried within the underground labyrinth over what appears to have been centuries of use. Some were found in natural resting positions, suggesting careful and deliberate placement. Others were found in contorted or unusual arrangements, leading some researchers to suggest that the burials may have involved ritualistic practices or even sacrificial ceremonies. Among the thousands of remains, a small number of skulls stood out. They were elongated, with abnormally long craniums and, in some cases, missing cranial sutures, the natural joints between the plates of the skull. These features were unlike anything found in typical human populations, and they immediately attracted speculation. Were these skulls the result of artificial cranial deformation, a practice documented in many ancient cultures around the world where the heads of infants were bound to create an elongated appearance? Or were they something else entirely? The remains of a population with naturally unusual skull morphology, possibly a distinct lineage that has since disappeared? The answer may never be known, because most of these unusual skulls have since vanished. They were reportedly displayed in museums at one point, but over the decades they disappeared from public view. Whether they were lost, misplaced, or deliberately removed is unclear. Only a few photographs and scattered reports remain, adding an unsettling layer of mystery to an already deeply enigmatic site. Perhaps the most extraordinary feature of the hypogeum is something you cannot see at all. You can only hear it. Deep within the middle level of the complex, there is a small chamber known as the Oracle Room. Researchers who have studied the Oracle Room's acoustics have found that it resonates at a frequency of approximately 110 Hz. This is significant because studies in neuroscience and psychoacoustics have shown that this specific frequency can have measurable effects on the human brain. Exposure to sound at 110 Hz has been associated with shifts in brainwave activity with the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought and self-awareness, showing reduced activity, while other regions associated with emotional processing and altered states of consciousness become more active. In practical terms, prolonged exposure to this frequency can induce feelings of deep calm, meditative states, and in some cases trance-like experiences. This has led many researchers to propose that the Oracle Room, and possibly the Hypogeum as a whole, was not merely a burial site but a place of ritual, a temple where sound was used as a tool for spiritual transformation. Imagine entering this underground space 5,000 years ago. You descend into darkness, your way lit only by flickering oil lamps or torches. The air is cool and still, the walls curve around you, and then, from somewhere within the stone, a voice begins to chant. The sound fills the chamber, reverberates through your body, and the rational part of your mind begins to quiet. You feel the vibration in your chest, in your skull, in the bones of your hands. The boundary between your body and the stone seems to dissolve. For the people who built this place, this would not have been mere acoustics. It would have been communion with something beyond the physical world. The builders of the Hypogeum are generally identified as members of Malta's Neolithic temple culture, a civilization that thrived on the island between approximately 4000 and 2500 BCE. This culture was responsible for some of the most impressive megalithic architecture in the ancient Mediterranean, including the Gantija temples, Hagar Kim and Mnadra, all of which are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But the temple culture of Malta remains poorly understood. They left behind no written records, no deciphered inscriptions, and no clear indication of their political or social structure. What we know about them comes almost entirely from their buildings and their burials. The Gantija temples on the island of Gozo, which translates roughly as the Giant's Tower, are particularly significant. They were constructed around 3600 BCE, making them roughly 5,600 years old, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by a full millennium. The temples are built from coralline limestone blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, and they feature elaborate internal layouts with multiple apses, altars, and decorated stones that suggest a complex ritual life. Local legend attributes their construction to a giantess who built them single-handedly while carrying her child, a myth that speaks to the sheer improbability of what these Neolithic people achieved. What is remarkable about the Maltese temple culture is the concentration of their achievement on such a small island. Malta is only 316 square kilometres, smaller than many cities, and yet it produced a building tradition that was, for its time, unmatched anywhere in the world. The temples, the Hypogeum, the elaborate burial practices, and the acoustic engineering of the Oracle Room all point to a society that invested enormous energy and creativity into its sacred architecture. They were not building houses or fortifications. They were building temples, places of connection between the human world and whatever they believed lay beyond it. And then, around 2500 BCE, the temple culture appears to have vanished. The temples stopped being built, the Hypogeum stopped receiving new burials, and new populations arrived on the island, people with different cultural practices and different building traditions, who showed no continuity with the temple builders who preceded them. What happened? The leading theories include environmental collapse, perhaps deforestation or soil depletion on the small island that made agriculture unsustainable. Disease is another possibility. Some researchers have speculated about a catastrophic event, a tsunami, a plague, or an invasion by a more aggressive culture from the Mediterranean mainland. But none of these theories has been conclusively proven. The temple culture simply stopped, leaving behind some of the most extraordinary buildings in the ancient world, and no explanation for their own disappearance. Some researchers have proposed that the Hypogeum may be even older than the temple culture, that it was inherited by them from an earlier, now unknown civilization. This theory is speculative, but it is fueled by the sheer sophistication of the underground complex, the unusual skulls, and the acoustic engineering of the oracle room, all of which suggest a level of knowledge and intentionality that goes beyond what we typically associate with Neolithic societies, adding to the mystery. Local Maltese folklore speaks of an underground world beneath the island, a network of tunnels and hidden chambers that extends far beyond the known limits of the Hypogeum. Some believe that parts of this underground network have never been discovered, that sealed passageways may lead to deeper, older structures that have yet to be explored. There have even been claims that children once disappeared into the tunnels and were never seen again, though these stories are impossible to verify and may be nothing more than folklore that has grown around the site's already eerie reputation. Today, the Hypogeum is one of the most tightly controlled archaeological sites in the world. Only a small number of visitors are permitted entry each day, and tours must be booked weeks or months in advance. The restriction is necessary to protect the delicate underground environment, which is vulnerable to changes in temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels caused by human presence. Even with these precautions, the site has suffered some deterioration over the past century, and ongoing conservation efforts aim to preserve it for future generations. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum is a haunting place. It is a reminder that history is often buried, sometimes literally, beneath the surface of the world we know. The labyrinthine chambers, the thousands of burials, the strange skulls, and the eerie acoustic properties of the oracle room all suggest that this underground temple was more than just a place for the dead. It was a place designed to blur the line between the living and the departed, between the physical world and whatever lies beyond it. Whether it was a sanctuary for sacred rituals, a place of prophecy and trance, or something even stranger, it remains one of the most enigmatic structures ever built by human hands. Not all ancient mysteries are buried underground. Some stand in the open, stretching across entire landscapes, their purpose as unclear today as it was thousands of years ago. And some of the most puzzling are not hidden in remote mountains or sealed beneath the sea, but arranged in plain sight, in long deliberate rows that seem to follow a logic we no longer understand. In the northwest corner of France, in the windswept region of Brittany, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against rocky cliffs and the countryside stretches out in rolling green fields, dotted with ancient farms and medieval churches, there is a landscape that does not belong to any era, that modern history can easily explain. Thousands of standing stones, massive slabs of granite, some over 6 meters tall, weighing as much as 50 tons, arranged in long, precise rows that stretch across the terrain for more than 4 kilometers. They are arranged in formations so deliberate, so carefully spaced, that from a distance they look like the columns of a vast open-air cathedral that was never given a roof. Up close, each stone is unique, its surface weathered by millennia of rain and wind, its base sunk deep into the earth as if it has always been there, as if it grew from the ground rather than being placed by human hands. These are the Karnak stones, and they are one of the largest and most mysterious megalithic sites on the planet. The sheer scale of Karnak is difficult to comprehend until you stand among the stones and try to take it in. There are more than 3,000 of them, spread across multiple distinct alignments. The 3 main groups are known as Lemenek, Camario, and Kerleskan. Lemenek alone contains over 1,100 stones arranged in 11 converging rows that stretch for more than a kilometre. Camario has over 1,000 stones in the 10 rows, and Kerleskan, the smallest of the 3, still contains hundreds of stones arranged in 13 rows, ending in a rough semicircle. In addition to the alignments, the Karnak complex includes several dolmens, stone burial chambers with massive capstones, and tumuli, mound-shaped burial sites that predate even the standing stones themselves. The largest tumulus at Karnak Saint-Michel is over 12 metres high and 125 metres long, and when it was excavated in the 19th century, researchers found burial chambers inside, containing jewellery, pottery and stone axes. Radiocarbon dating places the oldest elements of the Karnak complex at approximately 4500 BCE, though most of the standing stone alignments are believed to have been erected around 3300 BCE. To put that in perspective, this means the stones of Karnak were being raised before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built, before Stonehenge took its current form, and before most of the great civilizations of Mesopotamia had fully emerged. These are among the oldest monumental structures in the world, and we have almost no idea why they were built. The people who erected the Karnak stones left behind no written records, no inscriptions, no carved symbols that might explain their purpose. Unlike the Egyptians, who filled their monuments with hieroglyphic text describing their gods, their kings and their rituals, the builders of Karnak left nothing but the stones themselves. Everything we know about them comes from the physical evidence of the site and from the cultural context of Neolithic Europe, a period when agriculture was spreading, settled communities were forming, and the impulse to build large permanent structures was beginning to take hold across the continent. The most widely accepted theory is that the Karnak stones served as a kind of astronomical observatory, a massive outdoor instrument for tracking the movements of the sun, moon and stars. Several researchers have pointed out that certain alignments within the complex correspond to significant celestial events, including the summer and winter solstices and the equinoxes. If this is correct, it would mean that the Neolithic people of Brittany had a sophisticated understanding of the astronomical year, one that they embedded in stone on a scale that dwarfs anything else from the period. The idea has support. Alexander Thom, a Scottish engineer who spent decades surveying megalithic sites across Britain and France, proposed in the mid-20th century that the Karnak alignments were designed with precise geometric and astronomical principles, and that the builders had a standardized unit of measurement, which he called the megalithic yard, approximately 0.829 meters. Thom's theories were controversial and have been debated extensively, but the basic idea that the stones were aligned with celestial events has gained wider acceptance over time, even if the specifics remain disputed. Other theories focus on the religious or ceremonial purpose of the site. In many ancient cultures, large stones were considered sacred objects, imbued with spiritual power or believed to be the dwelling places of gods or ancestral spirits. The deliberate arrangements of the Karnak stones, combined with their association with nearby burial sites, suggest that the landscape was considered sacred, a place where the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world was thin. Some researchers have proposed that the stone rows may have functioned as processional pathways, routes along which people walked during ceremonies, festivals, or pilgrimages. The stones would have served as guides, marking the way and creating a structured or inspiring environment for ritual activity. Another theory, more practical in nature, suggests that the stones may have served as territorial markers, defining boundaries between different communities or tribal groups. In a landscape without fences, walls, or written deeds of ownership, large standing stones could have served as unmistakable boundary markers, visible from a great distance and too heavy to be moved by rival groups. This theory is less romantic than the astronomical or religious explanations, but it has the advantage of simplicity and is consistent with the use of standing stones in other Neolithic contexts. Then there are the local legends, which are colourful, if not scientifically illuminating. The most famous myth associated with the Karnak stones holds that a Roman legion was marching through Brittany when a local wizard, sometimes identified as the Arthurian figure Merlin, turned them all to stone, freezing them in their ranks for eternity. It is an entertaining story, and it has been told in various forms for centuries, but it does not explain why many of the stones predate the Roman Empire by more than 3,000 years. What the legend does reveal, however, is how deeply the stones have been embedded in the local culture, how they have been a source of wonder and speculation for as long as people have lived in the region. One of the most persistent questions about Karnak is how the stones were transported and erected. The largest stones weigh more than 50 tons, and they were placed in the ground with enough stability to remain upright for 5,000 years. The builders had no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals large enough to pull such weights. They had only human muscle, wooden levers, ropes woven from the plant fibres, and whatever ingenuity and organisational skill they could bring to the task. Moving a 50-ton stone without any of these modern aids is not theoretically impossible. Experimental archaeology has shown that large groups of coordinated workers using log rollers, sledges and earthen ramps can transport and erect surprisingly large stones with nothing more than Neolithic technology. But the sheer number of stones at Karnak means that this was not a one-time feat of engineering. It was a sustained, long-term construction program that would have required an enormous labour force working over decades, possibly centuries. The amount of social organisation required to plan, resource, and execute a project of this scale is itself a form of complexity that we do not always associate with Neolithic societies. Some researchers have drawn connections between Karnak and Stonehenge, which was built roughly 1,000 years after the Karnak alignments were erected. Both sites use massive stones arranged in deliberate patterns. Both appear to incorporate astronomical alignments, and both were built by Neolithic cultures that left behind no written records to explain their purpose. The question of whether there was a direct cultural connection between the builders of Karnak and the builders of Stonehenge, whether knowledge and traditions were passed along the trade routes or migration paths that connected the Atlantic coast of France to the British Isles, remains open, but the similarities are striking enough to suggest that the impulse to build with massive stones, to create permanent structures aligned with the movements of the heavens, was not isolated to a single group or a single location, but was part of a broader tradition that spread across Neolithic Europe. Why the site was eventually abandoned is another unanswered question. If Karnak served an important astronomical, religious, or territorial function for centuries, what changed? Did the people who built it migrate elsewhere? Did their society collapse due to environmental change, conflict, or some other disruption? Or did the cultural and spiritual traditions that gave the stones their meaning simply fade over time, replaced by new beliefs and new ways of understanding the world? We do not know. The stones remain. The people who raised them are gone, and the silence between those two facts is where the mystery lives. Today, the Karnak stones are a protected historical monument and a UNESCO World Heritage Site candidate. Conservation efforts have fenced off some of the alignments to prevent damage from foot traffic and tourism, though visitors can still walk among many of the stones and experience their scale firsthand. Modern studies using LiDAR scanning and geophysical surveys have revealed additional buried features at the site, including previously unknown stone structures and ditches that may have been part of the original complex. These findings suggest that what we see on the surface today is only a fraction of the original site, and that Karnak may have been even more extensive and more complex than we currently realise. The Karnak stones are a testament to what Neolithic people were capable of achieving. They are not rough, haphazard constructions. They are the product of planning, measurement, coordination, and sustained effort over generations. And yet, for all their permanence, for all their endurance through 5,000 years of weather and human history, they tell us almost nothing about the minds that conceived them or the hands that raised them. Like so many ancient mysteries, Karnak challenges the assumption that the past was simpler than the present. It forces us to consider that our ancestors understood things we have forgotten, saw patterns in the sky that we no longer notice, and built with a purpose that we can only guess at. Some mysteries span vast landscapes, visible only from above or stretching to the horizon. Others are more contained, more intimate, but no less puzzling. And some of the most confounding archaeological sites in the world are found in places that seem, at first glance, too remote and too dangerous to have ever attracted the attention of ancient civilizations. And yet there they are, in the remote highlands of northern Laos, in a region called the Jingqiuang Plateau. The landscape is quiet and green, a place of rolling hills and open valleys where the air is cool and the sky seems impossibly wide. It is a landscape that feels timeless, the kind of place where nothing much seems to happen and nothing much seems to change. But scattered across those hills and valleys, covering more than 90 separate sites, spanning thousands of square miles, are objects that do not belong to any world we recognize. Objects so large, so numerous, and so utterly without explanation that they have baffled researchers for decades. They are stone jars, thousands of them. Enormous vessels carved from solid rock, some standing nearly 3 meters tall, nearly 10 feet, and weighing several tons. They sit in the open fields, some clustered together in the tight groups, others standing alone in silent isolation, their wide mouths open to the sky. Some still have round stone lids lying nearby, displaced by time or by the people who last opened them, whenever and whoever that might have been. Their interiors are hollowed out, smooth and deep, as if they were designed to hold something, though exactly what that something was remains a matter of intense debate. This is the plain of jars, and it is one of the most unusual and least understood prehistoric sites anywhere in the world. More than 2,500 individual jars have been documented across the Jingqiuang Plateau, though the true number may be higher, as many areas remain inaccessible. The jars are carved from local stone, primarily sandstone, though some are made of granite and limestone, materials that would have required considerable effort to quarry, shape, and hollow out. The craftsmanship varies. Some jars are rough and utilitarian, while others show signs of careful smoothing and finishing. A few have rudimentary decorations, though most are unadorned. What they all share is their basic form, a cylindrical or slightly tapered shape with a wide opening at the top and a flat or slightly rounded bottom. No inscriptions have been found on any of the jars. No carvings, no symbols. Nothing that might tell us who made them when they were made, or what they were meant to contain. The jars are, in the most literal sense, blank vessels, offering no written clues to their purpose. In 2016, a team of scientists from the Australian National University conducted radiocarbon dating on materials found in and around the jars, confirming that the site dates back at least 2,500 years, placing the plain of jars firmly in the Iron Age, between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE. This makes the jars among the oldest megalithic structures in Southeast Asia, contemporary with the height of classical Greece and the early Roman Republic, though bearing no resemblance whatsoever to anything produced by those civilizations. The leading archaeological theory is that the plain of jars was an ancient funerary site, a vast open-air cemetery where the dead were processed through a complex sequence of burial practices. Excavations at some of the jar sites have uncovered human remains, including bones and cremated fragments, along with burial goods such as glass beads, iron tools, and ceramic vessels. This has led many researchers to propose that the jars served as temporary coffins, containers in which bodies were placed and left to decompose before the bones were gathered and interred in a final resting place nearby. This kind of secondary burial practice is known from other ancient cultures in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It reflects a belief system in which death is not a single event, but a process, a gradual transition from one state of being to another, requiring specific rituals at each stage. If the plain of jars was part of such a tradition, it would suggest a culture with deeply developed spiritual beliefs about death, transformation, and the afterlife. But the funerary theory, while compelling, does not explain everything. If the jars were burial containers, why are they scattered across such an enormous area? The 90-plus sites cover a region that would have taken days to cross on foot. A single centralized cemetery would have been far more practical. Instead, the jars are spread across the landscape as if marking something, following a pattern that extends far beyond what a single community would need for its dead. Some researchers have suggested that the different jar sites may represent different communities or tribal groups, each maintaining its own burial ground, but without written records or identifiable cultural markers on the jars themselves, this is difficult to confirm. Another theory proposes that the jars may have served a dual purpose, functioning not only as funerary vessels, but also as markers along ancient trade routes. The Chengkuang Plateau sits at a crossroads in mainland Southeast Asia, a natural corridor between the lowlands of the Mekong River Valley and the mountainous regions to the north and east. If the jar sites were positioned along the trade or migration paths, they may have served as waypoints, gathering places or territorial markers for groups moving through the region. Some of the jar clusters are found at sites with commanding views of the surrounding landscape, which would be consistent with a function as navigation aids or meeting points. Local legends offer their own explanations. The most famous story associated with the Plain of Jars describes a mythical king named Hun Chuam, who is said to have led a victorious army against a cruel oppressor. To celebrate his triumph, the king ordered the construction of enormous stone jars to be used as fermentation vessels for rice wine, lao lao, so that his army and the liberated people could feast together. In this version of the story, the jars are vessels of celebration, monuments to freedom and communal joy. It is a beautiful narrative, and it has been passed down through generations of Lao culture, though it does not account for the archaeological evidence of human remains found within the jars. Another local tradition speaks of the jars as being the work of giants, supernatural beings who carved the massive vessels as drinking cups or storage containers during a mythological age when the earth was inhabited by beings much larger and more powerful than ordinary humans. These stories, while not scientifically useful, reflect the deep impression that the jars have left on the communities that have lived among them for centuries. One of the greatest challenges in studying the Plain of Jars is the danger that surrounds the site. During the Vietnam War, and more specifically during the associated conflict known as the Secret War in Laos, the Siêng Khoang Plateau was subjected to one of the most intense bombing campaigns in history. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in the world. Much of that bombing was concentrated in the northeast, directly overlapping with the Plain of Jars. The result is that the landscape around the jar sites is still contaminated with unexploded ordnance, including cluster bombs, landmines and other munitions that failed to detonate on impact and remain buried in the soil to this day. Decades after the bombing ended, people are still being killed and injured by UXO in the region. The Mines Advisory Group and other organisations have been working to clear the area, but the contamination is so widespread that full clearance will take decades more. For archaeologists, this means that much of the Plain of Jars remains off limits. Large-scale excavation is extremely dangerous, and even walking through some areas carries significant risk. The jar sites that have been studied represent only a fraction of the total complex, and it is likely that many more jars and many more clues to their purpose remain hidden in areas that cannot yet be safely explored. Despite these obstacles, the Plain of Jars received international recognition in 2019 when it was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, acknowledging its significance as one of the most important archaeological landscapes in Southeast Asia. The inscription has brought increased attention and funding for both conservation and demining efforts, raising hopes that more of the site can be safely studied in the years to come. Adding to the mystery is the fact that many of the jars appear to be unfinished. Some lie broken on the ground, split apart as if they cracked during the carving process. Others are only partially hollowed out, as if their creators abandoned them mid-production. This has led some researchers to suggest that the work of creating the jars was interrupted suddenly, perhaps by a war, a natural disaster, or some other catastrophic event that forced the builders to flee before their work was complete. If so, what happened, And where did they go? The identity of the people who created the Plain of Jars remains one of the site's most fundamental, unanswered questions. No definitive historical records link the Jars to any known kingdom, culture, or ethnic group. Some researchers have speculated that they were built by ancestors of the Mon Khmer peoples who have inhabited mainland Southeast Asia for thousands of years. Others have proposed connections to early Austroasiatic cultures that predated the Lao and Thai civilizations that later dominated the region, but without written records, without identifiable art or cultural markers on the jars, and with much of the site still inaccessible. Due to UXO contamination, the question of who built the Plain of Jars remains wide open. What is clear is that someone, thousands of years ago, invested an extraordinary amount of time and effort into carving and placing these massive stone vessels across the landscape. The work required quarrying, shaping, hollowing, and transporting stones that weighed several tons each, using nothing more than the tools and techniques available during the Iron Age. It was not the work of a few individuals. It was the work of a civilization, an organized, motivated, and skilled group of people who chose to leave their mark on the world in a form that has endured for millennia, even as their names, their language, and their history have been entirely erased by time. The Plain of Jars sits quietly in the highlands of Laos, its massive stone vessels open to the sky, waiting for answers that may be years or decades away. It is one of those rare places where the past feels both incredibly close and impossibly distant. The jars are right there, solid and real and unmovable, but the people who carved them are gone, leaving behind nothing but these silent containers and the unanswerable questions they hold. Some mysteries are hidden in the plain sight, their presence obvious, but their meaning concealed. Others are hidden in a different way, not in the objects themselves, but in what they reveal about the world, in the knowledge they contain that seems impossible for their time. And sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that suggest our maps of the ancient world are incomplete, that people travelled further, knew more, and saw things that no one was supposed to see for centuries to come. In the year 1513, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Ahmed Muhiddin Piri, known to history as Piri Reis, sat down to compile a map of the world. He was working in the great maritime tradition of the Ottoman Empire, a civilization that by the early 16th century had become one of the most powerful and sophisticated naval forces on earth. Piri Reis was not just a sailor. He was a scholar, a collector of geographic knowledge, and a meticulous draftsman who understood that the power of an empire depended in part on the accuracy of its maps. The map he produced was drawn on gazelle skin parchment. It depicted the coastlines of Europe, the western coast of Africa, and the eastern coast of the Americas, still a recent discovery for Europeans at that time. Columbus had made his first voyage only 21 years earlier, and the true extent of the New World was still being mapped by Spanish and Portuguese explorers. Piri Reis's map was, by the standards of its time, an impressive piece of cartography, incorporating the latest available knowledge about the world's geography. But the map contained something else, something that, when it was rediscovered 4 centuries later, would ignite one of the most persistent and controversial debates in the history of cartography. The map was lost for hundreds of years. It was not until 1929, when historians working in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul discovered the document in a dusty archive, that it came to the attention of the modern world, and when researchers began to study it closely, they noticed something extraordinary about the southern portion of the map. Below the depiction of South America, extending to the bottom of the parchment, there appeared to be a coastline, a long, detailed coastline that did not correspond to any known landmass adjacent to South America. Instead, some researchers argued it appeared to depict the northern coast of Antarctica. This was, to put it mildly, a problem. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, when Russian, British, and American expeditions first sighted the continent. In 1513, when Piri Reis drew his map, no European explorer had come anywhere near the southern polar region. The continent would remain unknown to the wider world for another 3 centuries. And yet, if the southern section of the map truly showed Antarctica, then someone, at some point in history, had mapped the continent and recorded its coastline with enough accuracy for that knowledge to eventually reach an Ottoman admiral in the 16th century. But the controversy does not end there, because the coastline depicted on the map does not show Antarctica as it appears today, buried under a sheet of ice that is, in places, nearly 5 kilometres thick. Instead, it appears to show the landmass beneath the ice, the actual rocky coastline of the continent as it would look without its frozen covering. Modern geological surveys, conducted using seismic sounding and satellite radar, have mapped the subglacial terrain of Antarctica in detail, and when researchers compared the Piri Reis map to these modern surveys, some found what they considered a remarkable correspondence between the coastline on the map and the actual shape of Antarctica's hidden landmass. If this interpretation is correct, the implications are staggering. The last time Antarctica is believed to have been free of ice, at least in significant portions, was roughly 6,000 years ago, and possibly much longer. This would mean that someone mapped the continent's coastline at a time when no known civilization was supposed to have been capable of such a feat. Before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, Piri Reis himself provided a clue about the sources of his knowledge. In notes written in the margins of the map, he stated that he had compiled it from approximately 20 older source maps. Some of these, he said, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, the 4th century BCE. Others, he claimed, were drawn by Arab and Portuguese cartographers of his own era, and at least one was attributed to Christopher Columbus himself. This means that Piri Reis was not claiming to have personally surveyed the lands he depicted. He was working as a compiler, bringing together geographic knowledge from many different sources, some of them ancient, and assembling them into a single, comprehensive document. The question, then, is not whether Piri Reis himself knew about Antarctica. It is whether the ancient source maps he drew from contained that knowledge, and if they did, where did that knowledge come from? Who mapped the coastline of a continent that was supposedly unknown to the world until the 19th century? The most cautious interpretation is that the southern portion of the map does not depict Antarctica at all. Many early 16th century maps were often distorted in this way, especially at their edges, where the cartographer's knowledge was most uncertain and the challenges of representing a curved surface on flat parchment were most acute. Under this interpretation, the map is impressive for its time, but it does not contain any anomalous geographic knowledge. It is simply a map that gets less accurate the further it reaches from the areas its creator knew best. This is a reasonable explanation, and it is the one most commonly endorsed by professional cartographers. The map does contain known errors and distortions in other areas, which is consistent with the limitations of 16th century cartography. And the southern landmass on the map lacks the kind of specific detail, such as the Antarctic Peninsula or the Ross Sea, that would make a definitive identification of Antarctica more convincing. But others remain unconvinced. Charles Hapgood, an American history professor, published a book in 1966 called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, in which he argued that the Piri Reis map, along with several other medieval and Renaissance-era maps, contained geographic knowledge that could only have come from an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization. Hapgood proposed that a sophisticated culture had mapped the world, including Antarctica, during a period when the continent was still partially free of ice, and that this knowledge had been passed down through generations of seafaring cultures, copied and recopied across millennia, gradually degrading but never entirely disappearing. By the time Piri Reis encountered these ancient source maps, the knowledge they contained had been so far removed from its original context that no one understood its significance. Hapgood's theory was endorsed remarkably by Albert Einstein, who wrote the foreword to an earlier version of the book, praising Hapgood's careful and systematic approach to the evidence. Einstein's endorsement lent the theory a degree of credibility that it might not otherwise have received. though it is important to note that Einstein was commenting on the methodology of the research, not necessarily endorsing the specific conclusion about Antarctic mapping. The theory of ancient source maps, while fascinating, has significant weaknesses. There is no direct physical evidence of the ancient civilization that Hapgood proposed. No ruins, no artifacts, no writings that can be definitively linked to a pre-Ice Age mapping culture. The comparisons between the Peary Ray's map and modern Antarctic surveys, while intriguing at first glance, have been challenged by cartographers who argue that the similarities are less precise than proponents claim, and that selective interpretation can make almost any coastline appear to match. There is also the question of how such a civilization could have mapped Antarctica in the first place. Even with advanced seafaring technology, surveying an entire continent's coastline requires not just the ability to reach it, but the tools and methods to accurately measure distances, angles, and positions across thousands of kilometres. This requires, at minimum, an understanding of longitude, a problem that European navigators did not solve reliably until the 18th century with the invention of the marine chronometer. And yet, the mystery persists, because even if the southern coastline on the Peary Race map is not Antarctica, the map raises real questions about the extent of ancient geographic knowledge. The portions of the map depicting the Americas are remarkably accurate for 1513. The coastline of Brazil in particular is rendered with a level of detail that surpasses many European maps from the same period. This suggests that Piri Reis had access to source material of genuinely high quality, material that reflected careful observation and measurement by skilled navigators. Where did that material come from? Piri Reis mentioned ancient sources dating back to Alexander's era. If such maps truly existed, they have since been lost. The great libraries of the ancient world, including the Library of Alexandria, are known to have contained vast collections of maps, geographic texts, and navigational guides, most of which were destroyed by fire, war, or neglect. It is entirely possible that the ancient world possessed cartographic knowledge that was far more extensive and more accurate than anything that survived into the medieval period. The Piri Reis map may be a tantalizing echo of that lost knowledge, a fragment of a geographic tradition that was once far more complete. Whether or not the map shows Antarctica, whether or not an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization ever existed, the Piri Reis map stands as a reminder that the history of human exploration is longer and more complex than any single document can capture. Maps are not just tools for navigation, they are records of knowledge, and when the knowledge they contain exceeds what should have been known at the time of their creation, they become windows into possibilities that challenge everything we assume about the past. Today, the Piri Reis map is housed in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, where it is displayed as one of the great treasures of Ottoman cartography. It is consulted by historians, studied by cartographers, and debated by researchers who continue to disagree about what its southern coastline truly depicts. It has inspired books, documentaries, and endless speculation, and it remains, more than 500 years after it was drawn, one of the most discussed and most controversial maps in history. The thought that an ancient civilization might have mapped a continent before it was buried under ice is both unsettling and exhilarating. It suggests that the story of human exploration may stretch back much further than we realise, that people travelled farther, knew more, and recorded their discoveries in ways that have since been lost to time. But sometimes the secrets of the past are not found on ancient parchments or hidden in lost archives. Sometimes they are found beneath the waves, in the ruins of cities that once stood in the sunlight, where people lived, worked, and traded before the sea came and took it all away. Just off the southern coast of the Peloponnese, in a shallow bay along the coast of Laconia, Greece, the water is clear and calm. The Mediterranean sun filters through the surface, casting shifting patterns of light across the sandy bottom. Seagrass sways gently in the current. From the surface it looks like any other stretch of the Greek coastline, quiet, beautiful, and unremarkable. But look more closely. Look beneath the surface and the seafloor reveals something that should not be there. Streets, walls, foundations of buildings, courtyards, the unmistakable grid of an organised settlement, laid out with the kind of careful planning that suggests not a village, not a temporary camp, but a city. A real city, with homes and marketplaces and drainage channels, all of it submerged under a few metres of seawater, eerily preserved, as if the ocean simply rose one day and swallowed everything gently and completely, without disturbing a single stone. This is Pavlopetri, and it is one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world. The site was first discovered in 1967 by Nicholas Fleming, a British oceanographer who was surveying the seafloor off the coast of Laconia. Fleming noticed what appeared to be man-made structures beneath the shallow water and recognised immediately that he was looking at something significant. He brought in a team of divers who confirmed the presence of walls, building foundations and streets, all clearly arranged in an organised pattern that indicated a once thriving settlement. Fleming published his findings and the archaeological world took notice. But at the time, the technology to properly study an underwater site of this complexity did not yet exist. Detailed investigation would have to wait decades. It was not until 2009 that a comprehensive archaeological survey was finally undertaken. A team led by Dr. John Henderson of the University of Nottingham, working in collaboration with the Hellenic Centre for Marine Research, used advanced techniques including three-dimensional mapping, digital photogrammetry, and acoustic surveying to create the first detailed plan of the submerged city. What they found exceeded all expectations. Pavlopetri was not a small coastal settlement. It was a well-planned urban centre, covering an area of at least 30,000 square metres, with clearly defined streets, stone-built houses, courtyards, and what appeared to be a central marketplace or public gathering area. Some of the buildings showed evidence of two-storey construction. The streets followed a grid-like pattern, suggesting deliberate urban planning rather than organic, unstructured growth. And there were signs of a drainage or water management system, channels cut into the stone that appeared designed to direct the flow of rainwater or waste away from the living areas. This was, by any measure, a sophisticated settlement, and it was old, very old. Radiocarbon dating and ceramic analysis placed the earliest occupation of Pavlopetri at approximately 2800 BCE, with evidence suggesting the city was inhabited continuously for roughly 2,000 years, from the early Bronze Age through the late Mycenaean period, around 1200 BCE. To put that in perspective, the earliest layers of Pavlopetri predate classical Greece, the Greece of Socrates and Plato and the Parthenon, by nearly 2,500 years. When Pavlopetri was a thriving city, the Minoan civilization on Crete was in its early stages. The Great Pyramids of Egypt were newly built, and Stonehenge was still under construction. The artifacts recovered from the site include pottery, tools, and household items that span the full range of the settlement's occupation. Some of the earliest pottery matches styles found at early Minoan and Cycladic sites, suggesting that Pavlopetri was part of a broad Aegean trading network that connected communities across the islands and coastal regions of the eastern Mediterranean. Later pottery matches Mycenaean styles, indicating that the city continued to thrive through one of the most dynamic periods in ancient Greek history. The variety of artifacts paints a picture of a community that was not just surviving, but thriving. Stone tools and obsidian blades suggest both local craftsmanship and long-distance trade, since obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its razor-sharp edges, had to be imported from distant islands such as Melos in the Cyclades. Bronze implements found at the site speak to metalworking capability, or, at minimum, access to the bronze trade networks that define the era. And the diversity of pottery styles found across the different occupation layers tells a story of cultural evolution, of a community that absorbed new influences, adapted to changing fashions, and maintained connections with the wider Aegean world across 2 full millennia. what daily life looked like in Pavlopetri is something we can only partially reconstruct. But the evidence suggests a community organised around maritime activity and trade. The men and women who lived here would have been familiar with the sea in an intimate way, watching ships arrive carrying goods from Crete, from the Cycladic Islands, from the coasts of Asia Minor. They would have known the seasonal rhythms of Mediterranean sailing, the summer winds that filled the sails and the winter storms that kept boats ashore. Their children would have grown up with the sounds of a busy coastal settlement, the voices of merchants, the scraping of hulls on the beach, the hammering of stone masons building and repairing the homes that now sit silent on the seafloor. It was a life that was, in many ways, not so different from that of coastal communities throughout the Mediterranean today. And yet it ended. The water came, and everything they built was slowly claimed by the sea. The location of Pavlopetri was strategically significant. Sitting on the southern tip of the Peloponnese, near the island of Elafonisos, it was positioned along one of the major maritime trade routes of the ancient Aegean. Ships travelling between the Greek mainland, Crete, the Cycladic Islands, and the eastern Mediterranean would have passed through this area regularly. A well-organised settlement with port facilities in this location would have been ideally placed to participate in and profit from the maritime trade that was the lifeblood of Bronze Age Aegean civilizations. Some researchers believe that Pavlopetri was not just a participant in this trade network but a significant hub, a place where goods from across the Mediterranean were exchanged, where ships resupplied, and where cultures met and mingled. The size and sophistication of the settlement support this interpretation. This was not a fishing village that happened to sit near a trade route. This was a city built by people who understood the economic importance of their location and organised their community accordingly. And then, at some point, the sea took it. The most likely explanation for Pavlopetri's submersion is a combination of tectonic activity and gradual sea level rise. The southern Peloponnese sits in a tectonically active region where the African and Eurasian plates converge, producing the kind of seismic activity that has shaped the Mediterranean landscape for millions of years. Earthquakes in this region can cause sections of coastline to drop suddenly, a process known as subsidence, which would have lowered the land on which Pavlopetri stood relative to the sea level. Over time, possibly over centuries, the water crept in, covering the streets, filling the homes and eventually submerging the entire city beneath a few meters of water. Some researchers believe the submersion was gradual, slow enough that the inhabitants had time to evacuate. This theory is supported by the notable absence of human remains at the site. Unlike Pompeii, where the residents were trapped and killed by volcanic eruption, Pavlopetri appears to have been abandoned, its people leaving before the water claimed their city entirely. Where they went is unknown. They may have moved inland. They may have founded new settlements along higher ground. They may have been absorbed into other communities in the region. Whatever happened, they left behind their city, their homes, their marketplace and their streets, all of which the sea has preserved with remarkable fidelity for more than 3,000 years. The preservation of Pavlopetri is one of the aspects that makes it so valuable to archaeologists. Because the site was submerged in shallow, relatively calm water, and because the sandy bottom provided a protective layer over many of the structures, the city's layout has survived intact to a degree that is rare for any ancient site, let alone one that has been underwater for millennia. The streets are still traceable. The walls of buildings are still standing, in some cases to a height of several courses. The outlines of individual rooms are clearly visible. It is possible to walk through the submerged ruins and gain a remarkably clear picture of how the city was organised and how its residents lived. Dr. Henderson described Pavlopetri as a rare window into the distant past, a site that preserves not just individual artefacts, but the entire fabric of a city, the spatial relationships between buildings, the flow of streets, and the logic of its urban design. For archaeologists studying the Bronze Age Aegean, this kind of contextual information is invaluable. Individual artifacts tell us what people made and used. A preserved city tells us how they lived. But Pavlopetri is also fragile. Despite having survived for thousands of years beneath the sea, the site is now under threat from modern activity. Its shallow depth makes it accessible not just to researchers, but to swimmers, divers, boaters, and anyone who happens to wander through the area. Anchor damage from boats has already disturbed some sections of the site. Pollution from nearby coastal development poses an ongoing risk, and natural erosion, accelerated by climate change and rising sea levels, continues to wear away at the structures that have endured for so long. Conservation efforts are underway. The Greek government has taken steps to protect the site, and international organisations have advocated for its preservation. The three-dimensional maps created during the 2009 survey provide a detailed digital record of the city that will endure even if the physical site deteriorates further. But the reality is that Pavlopetri is in a race against time. A city that survived the original catastrophe that submerged it now faces new threats from the modern world. What makes Pavlopetri so compelling is not just its age or its preservation, but what it represents. It is proof that urban civilization in the Aegean began earlier and was more sophisticated than we once assumed. Before the classical Greeks, before the Mycenaeans at their height, before the great palaces of Crete reached their full glory, there were people on the southern coast of Greece who were building planned cities, organising trade networks and managing complex societies. Pavlopetri pushes the timeline of European urban life back by centuries, and forces us to reconsider how quickly and how completely human societies could develop in the ancient Mediterranean. Unlike mythical cities like Atlantis, which have captured the public imagination for millennia, Pavlopetri is real. It is documented. It is mapped. You can swim over its ruins and see the outlines of its streets with your own eyes. And yet in its own way it is just as haunting as any legend. A city that thrived for 2,000 years, that was home to generations of families, traders and craftspeople, that was connected by sea to the great civilizations of its age, and that one day, slowly or suddenly, disappeared beneath the waves. The people of Pavlopetri left behind their homes, their tools, their marketplace, and the roads they walked every day. What they did not leave behind were their names, their language, their stories, or any written record of who they were. Like so many of the mysteries we have explored tonight, Pavlopetri is a place where the physical evidence is astonishing, but the human story behind it remains just out of reach. The lost city sits quietly beneath the Mediterranean, its stones still arranged in the patterns its builders intended, its streets still pointing toward a marketplace where people once gathered to trade, to talk, to live. It is a place that feels both incredibly close and impossibly distant. The stones are right there, but the voices are gone, and maybe that is the thread that connects all of the mysteries we have explored tonight. From the impossible walls of Sacsayhuaman to the Viking swords forged from steel that should not have existed, from the frozen bones scattered around a Himalayan lake to the spiral of symbols on a clay disc that no one can read, from the vast empty chambers beneath China to the underground temple in Malta where sound itself was used as a tool, from the thousands of standing stones in Brittany to the enormous jars scattered across the highlands of Laos, from a 16th century map that seems to show a continent centuries before it was discovered, to a city that has been hiding beneath the sea for 3,000 years. Each of these discoveries tells us something about the people who came before us. They were builders, engineers, navigators and thinkers. They moved stones that weighed hundreds of tons. They forged metal that would not be matched for 8 centuries. They carved entire underground worlds out of solid rock. They created writing systems that we still cannot read. They buried their dead in frozen mountain passes and in underground labyrinths. They arranged massive stones in patterns that tracked the movements of the stars, and they built cities so well planned that their ruins are still recognizable thousands of years later, even submerged beneath the ocean. These are not the accomplishments of primitive people. These are the accomplishments of civilizations that understood their world in ways that we are only beginning to appreciate, and the fact that so many of their achievements remain unexplained, that so many of their methods and motivations have been lost to time, is itself a kind of discovery. It tells us that the story of humanity is not a simple straight line from ignorance to knowledge. It is something far more complex, far more fragmented and far more mysterious than that. History is filled with lost chapters, forgotten peoples, erased civilizations, and questions that, despite all our technology and all our expertise, we still cannot answer. Perhaps that is the most humbling realization of all. We live in an age of satellites, genome sequencing, ground-penetrating radar, and artificial intelligence, and yet the walls of Sacsayhuaman, the steel of the Ulfbert, and the symbols on the Paistos disc remain as mysterious today as they were when they were first discovered. The past does not give up its secrets easily. It makes us work for every answer, and for every answer it provides, it seems to offer two new questions in return. The deeper we look, the more questions arise, and one thing becomes clear. There is far more to our past than we have been led to believe. If you enjoyed this journey through the unknown, subscribe so you do not miss the next time we explore the forgotten corners of history. And if you would like to support the channel and get all of our content without ads, the Patreon link is in the description below. Thank you for listening, and as always, until next time, stay safe.